قناة بالستون تقدم
The Moroccan Neighborhood, Almagharbeh Neighborhood. Written by Alaa Suleiman. Translated to English by Osama Almethani. Narrated by Enab. The grandfather is getting ready to go out to the Marrakesh market, and Abraham ran towards the door, preparing to go with his grandfather. The grandfather was sad and upset. He grabbed Abraham's hand and headed together to the market near their home. On the way, the grandfather remained unusually silent, hiding his tears in his eyes. Abraham was walking next to his grandfather amazed, looking at his footsteps once and then turning his head to see the sad and silent grandfather. He curiously asked his grandfather about the reason of being sad and silence. "I was saddened by a message I received today from my relatives in Jerusalem," the grandfather answered. "I didn't know we had relatives in Jerusalem, Grandpa. Tell me, what saddened you with the letter?" said Abraham surprisingly. The grandfather said, "I'll tell you when we get home, my little boy." Once they finished shopping, they left the market going back home. With the confusion in his mind, Abraham was wondering and questioning himself. What saddens my grandfather? And who are my relatives, those I've never heard of? Why do they live in Jerusalem? Oh, why is our house so far from the market? When are we going to get home for my grandfather to tell me about it? When? But when they arrived at the house, the grandfather entered his room and closed the door, while Abraham sat on the couch in the living room, confused and thinking. Shortly afterwards, the grandfather came out of the room carrying a set of papers and pictures and sat next to Abraham and then looked at him and said, "You know, my little boy, I have never seen my grandfather. My grandfather, Abu Madian al-Ghouth, traveled to Palestine a long time ago and lived in Jerusalem. He owned there a few lands that later named the Moroccan's Neighbourhood, Almagharbeh Neighbourhood, after my Moroccan grandfather, who was very generous and hospitable, as he used to offer people coming to Jerusalem places to live in, especially people coming from the Maghreb countries or even immigrants from Africa to Jerusalem." Abraham was listening carefully to his grandfather. Then he gently approached his grandfather and held his hand with tenderness and love. The grandfather continued, "Thus, our parents and relatives lived in the Moroccan neighborhood in Jerusalem, next to the holy Al-Aqsa Mosque, and worked in making margarine and extracting sesame oil. And they also worked on the manufacture of soap, embroidered weaving, Moroccan textiles, and Moroccan food. The Jerusalemites loved them very much, merged with them and married them, until the Zionist occupation came in 1967 and ordered the destruction of the entire neighborhood. Abraham was burned down, saying, 'Did they destroy the neighborhood, Grandpa? What did our relatives do there?' The grandfather nodded his head and said, 'Yes, my son. The bulldozers of the occupation bulldozed their homes and turned the land they were living in into a special square for Jews coming to worship at Al-Buraq Wall, which they called the Wailing Wall.'" Abraham interrupted his grandfather's words, asking, "What is Al-Buraq Wall? Why do Jews call it the Wailing Wall?" The grandfather stopped talking and pointed his face away to hide his tears falling on his cheek, and some of the pictures he was holding scattered and fell to the ground. So Abraham rushed and picked them up and began looking at them, and then said, "Where did these old pictures take place, Grandpa?" The grandfather replied, "These are pictures of the houses of my relatives in the Moroccan neighborhood before it was demolished. And this is an old picture for the Moroccan's door, Almagharbeh door. one of Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque gates. Abraham began to meditate on the pictures and turned them around as the grandfather stood up and said, "Tomorrow I'll tell you what the story of Al-Buraq wall and why they call it the Wailing Wall." Abraham jumped and hugged his grandfather and said, "Yes, Grandpa, I want you to tell me everything about Jerusalem and Palestine. I want to know everything." To preserve intellectual property rights, the historical and cultural information contained in the story was with the help of the friends Mrs. Sumaya Al-Momani and her husband, Mr. Osama Al-Shayeb.